Hello, my elegant warriors. Welcome back to the podcast. Once again, I am doing this particular podcast on YouTube by myself, looking at the camera and probably looking a lot at my notes this week, and also on the podcast for you. This is so that if you prefer to watch these things, you can watch me on YouTube, just staring at you talking. And if you prefer to listen to these things in the podcast, then you can do it the way that you have always done it. Today, I am talking to you about books. If you're a longtime listener, you know that this is one of my favorite things to talk about. You know that I'm a little bit obsessed with books and that I love, love, love to read. I'm also very blessed because I'm a very fast reader. When I was a kid, and I've told this story before, they used to think that I wasn't really reading when I would say I'm done with this book. They thought that I was lying. And so they would test me on my comprehension. And then when they realized that I was actually reading the books that I said I was reading, they couldn't figure out how I was reading them that fast. And so they took me out of class and brought me to this room, and the room was dark and the words were up on a wall, and they would go by and I would tell them faster, faster, and I would read the words off the wall and then have to answer questions about them. And I don't know what the results of that test were, but it ultimately came to the conclusion that I read very quickly and so was going to be allowed to sort of read at my pace and not be questioned as to whether or not I was pulling some sort of a scam on the teachers. Last year, I read more than 200 books. This year, I read 134 fiction books and only 55 nonfiction books. And that's unusual for me. For me to read fewer nonfiction than fiction is unusual for me. However, I'm really enjoying fiction. I as a kid, that's all I read was fiction. I didn't read a lot of nonfiction until I got to like late high school and then college, and I started studying psychology. I majored in psychology. That's what my degree is in. And I loved the self-help books, and sort of the pendulum sort of swung. But now that I'm in my middle ages, I am swinging back to fiction and I just love it. So this year I read much more fiction, 134 fiction books, 55 nonfiction books. And what I thought I would do today is share with you my top five in each group. I want to say genre, but really in each genre, there's a million other genres, but I'll talk about that as I go through all of these. Now, all of these books didn't come out this year. Some of them did. And in fact, I think most of the fiction books came out this year, but the nonfiction books, I find them sort of differently. I find fiction books often because they're what's being published and what's out there and what's at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Whereas my nonfiction books, I usually find because it's something that I'm interested in, or something that I hear someone speak about, or something that I hear in a podcast. And so it's often a little bit different. Let's start with the fiction books. And this is in no particular order because I don't know that I could pick a favorite. And if I was to pick a favorite, it would probably be the one that I read most recently. Because when I went back over the list, I was like, oh, yeah, that was a good book. And I had forgotten that I had read it, and I had forgotten that I had read it this year. So the first book that I want to share is a different one for me. I liked the Harry Potter books fine, but I was never big into the Harry Potter books. And I only read them because everyone else was reading them. When I was young, I was really into fairies, and I believed I was a fairy, and I believed that there were fairies and all of those things. So it's not that I'm against the magical, but it just was never a thing for me. However, this book, The House in the Cerulean Sea, so it's House in the Cerulean, The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, Klune. It is a magical book. It is about a magical place and a man who works sort of in the administration at that magical place. And his name is Linus, and he is assigned to go and check on an orphanage that is in this house on the Cerulean Sea. And he goes to that house and he meets the children in the house, and the children are different types of magical creatures. And he meets the person who is taking care of those children, the entities that are taking care of those children, and he builds relationships, and he changes and they change. And I loved this book. It was recommended to me by one of my mom's friends, Nancy Miranda. She messaged me on Facebook and said that I would enjoy this, and I told her I'd give it a shot. To be honest, I wasn't so sure I would because it wasn't my type of book. I laughed many times in this book. I cried more than once in this book, and it stays with me still. I highly recommend it. It's also interesting. There's LGBTQ characters, which I love to see, and especially in all kinds of genres, not just like rom-coms. I know more rom-coms are coming out with LGBTQ characters, which I think is great. But a book like this, to see it, I think it's wonderful. There's the magical piece of it, but the magical piece is also a great metaphor for a lot of things that might be going on in your life. So I highly recommend this book, even if you're only a little into magic. If it's totally not your thing, then this is probably not the book for you, but I loved it. Second book this year that I loved, and this one, I loved it. It was called The Change by Kirsten Miller. The subtitle of this book really says it all. It says, "It's not over, it's time." And this book is really about, and to my mind, meant for women who are at or approaching or around middle age. It's about three women who are at that stage of their lives. Harriet, Nessa, and Joe. I fell in love with these women. My sister-in-law recommended this book, my sister-in-law, Jamie, and I talked to her about it. And I told her that Harriet was going to become a verb for me, that I was going to Harriet the situation, because I just thought Harriet was such a rock star in this book. An interesting rock star. And the book is an interesting one. It's different. It's got a little bit of magic in it as well. It's about three women who find the body of a teenage girl in their small affluent community. And then when the police aren't doing what they feel they should be doing, they take it upon themselves to figure out what's going on. So it's a mystery. It's got a little bit of a magic thing to it as well. In fact, another one of my books does. So so maybe this was my year of magic. Who knows? But it's also got a huge reflection on middle age for women and what that means and what that can mean for us. And I just loved it. I will say, and I don't usually do well with these types of books, especially before bed. There is, because it's a mystery, there are some I wouldn't say gory scenes, but there's some scenes that aren't great. And sometimes those things bother me before I go to sleep. But for me, for this book, it just didn't. I don't know why. I recommended it to a friend who struggled with that a little bit. So if that's something that you struggle with, don't read it before bed. But I really highly recommend you read it, especially if you are a woman at that stage of life. I just loved it. I thought it was awesome. And I thought about it for a long time. Another book that I forgot that I had read this year, but when I went through the list, I was like, oh, I have to include this one. This one's also a thriller. This one also might not be the best for before bed, but for me, it was not a problem. I could not put this book down. I was like lapping it up. I thought it was phenomenal. Reese Witherspoon chose it as one of her book club picks. And I have to tell you guys, I don't know if she openly says that this is what she does, but I believe that this is what she does. And I think it's brilliant. She picks books, and then I believe she does it to see what the response will be. And if the response is good, then she turns them into movies. So she's turned a lot of the books that she's chosen where, I don't know that she did Where the Crawdad Sings. I know she picked the book, but it became a movie. Little Fires Everywhere became a movie. A lot of her book choices ultimately become movies. And this book, Wrong Time, Place, Wrong Time, I see this book becoming a movie. It's written by a woman named Gillian McAllister. And it's a story of a woman who's married and they have a teenage son. And she's looking out the window one night and she sees her son kill a stranger, and then he's arrested. And she goes to bed wondering what the hell's going on. And she wakes up the next day, and it's the day before the day that all happened. And then every time she wakes up, she's gone further back in time. And you'd think it would be totally confusing, but it's not. And as someone who has written, I have so much respect for this author. I can't imagine what it took to put this world together in this way and keep track of things and keep track of the storylines and the characters and allow them to change in a backwards way and then a forwards way. It is awesome and so good, and so keeps you on the edge of your seat, and so keeps you unsure of what's going on. And I highly, highly recommend it. So that is the third book. The fourth book I would recommend for this year is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. If you look at these books on Amazon, you'll see, I think this one was named like #1 in fiction this year on Amazon. It's another one that's a little bit magical. It is about a woman named Tova who, when her husband dies, she goes to work in an aquarium and she becomes close with the octopus, friendly with the octopus at the aquarium. His name is Marcellus. He is a character in the book. And there is a mystery in the book, and they work together, though apart, to sort of figure out what's going on. The characters in this book are amazing. The character of Marcellus is amazing. It's another one that just caught me in, and I thought about it all year long, and I knew I had to include it in my book list, even though I read it earlier in the year. And then the last one I also read earlier in the year, and I also knew I would include it. It is a delightful book. And if you listened last week, you know, delightful is one of my words for this year. This book is Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting. It's by Claire, Clare, Pooley, Pooley. And it is based in London. And it's the story of Iona Iverson. And she takes the train to her work every day and the different people that she meets on the train. And it is laugh out loud funny, and it's just a delight. There's nothing scary. There's, you know, there's a little bit of suspense. You want a book to have suspense, but it's a beautiful book. It's a book that you will laugh at. It's a book that you'll be interested in. It's a book that you will become invested in the characters. And I highly, highly recommend it. And that I just want to end on fiction with an honorable mention, a book that I just read. And to be honest, had I seen it in the bookstore, so let me back up. I read most of my fiction on the Kindle because I read it in bed. And on those occasions when I'm sharing a bed, it's much easier to read on a Kindle that lights itself up than to turn the light on. So I read fiction in bed on the Kindle for the most part, and I read nonfiction, you know, at night, in the morning, on the weekends, at the beach, wherever, but I read those mostly in hard copy books. Also, I go back to those and highlight them and want to refer to them for some of my speeches and some of my books. And so that makes a little bit more sense. So, had I seen this next book in a hard copy, I probably would not have picked it up because it was, I am holding my hands apart. It was probably, I don't know, 5 inches, 6 inches thick. It's a big old book. But it's by Barbara Kingsolver. And I love Barbara Kingsolver. I've always loved her books. And so when I knew she was coming out with a new book, I actually saw Oprah chose this book as her book club book, which is where I first became aware of it. It's called Demon Copperhead. And it is a book about a boy named Demon who is born in Kentucky. And it's about poverty, and it's about Oxycontin. It's about drugs, and it's about football, and it's about relationships, and it's about foster care. And it gave me a different perspective on things. You know, I often say to you that the only thing you have to choose is your attitude. And so even in the worst of circumstances, we can change a new attitude. But reading this book made me really see the perspective of someone who just doesn't think that that's available to them and doesn't think that they can choose a new attitude. For those of you watching on YouTube, you just saw me look back at my dog who's had a little sneezing fit. I want to make sure that he was doing okay, but it's okay because it's a good little break between the fiction books and the nonfiction books. So let's review. Honorable mention went to Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And then the 5 fiction books that I chose this year are: number 1, House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, The Change by Kirsten Miller, Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister, Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, and Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting by Clare Pooley. Now I'm going to pick up the dog because he's sitting at my feet waiting to be picked up, and say hello to the people. We are going to talk about the nonfiction books. Now, I only read 55 nonfiction books this year, which is not a lot for me. Usually that number is a lot greater, but I read a lot of really good ones, and it was hard for me to choose a favorite, but I have chosen 5. So here we go. The first one was a tough read for me. It's a lot about computers and artificial intelligence and computer systems, and none of that is the way that I talk or the way that I think or the way that I read. But the name of the book is Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And it's by Joel Lehman, Lehman, and Kenneth O. I can't read my own writing, so I'll have to put a link in the show notes to his last name. I think it stands. But the premise of the book is that the greatest achievements, big things, become less likely to happen when we make them to specific objectives. So they give all kinds of evidence that this is true, that you can set an objective to lose 5 pounds, or you can set an objective to save $20. But when you start talking about things like finding the cure for cancer or creating something that's never been created before, it is almost impossible to set objectives to get you there because you don't know how you're going to get there. That's sort of the premise of impossible things or things that have never been done before. And so they take the contention that we shouldn't be setting goals for those types of things. And instead, we should be adapting and following the little breadcrumbs, these are my words, not theirs, that take us are on our way to those impossible things. And I think the reason that I loved this book so much is because I do not set goals in the year. I have visions for the year. I have plans for the year. I have things that I want to do. But it's funny, when I was younger and we used to do vision boards, my friends and I, they would make fun of me because I had so much white space on the vision board. And I would always say, I just feel like the universe, for me, it's God, has bigger plans for me than I could ever imagine. And that's what I think the premise of this book is. It's that when it comes to huge things, you've got to leave white space because the universe has bigger plans than you ever could have imagined. And I love that there was all this scientific background for that premise. So, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, highly recommend it. It's scientific, it's computer heavy, but it's worth it. The next one I've referenced last week, and it's called Mindfulness by Ellen Langer. Now, this book came out in 2014, and in 2014, it was the 25th anniversary edition. So this is an older book. She has a new book coming out, I believe, in 2023. I will be waiting with bated breath. But this book is about mindfulness. She is the mother of mindfulness. She's based in Harvard, and the book is filled with studies about how when we are more mindful, when we notice things, when we are more open to what could be, when we are more open to what is possible, we see things in ways that we never saw them before, and we can be healthier, we can be more well liked, we can be seen as more charismatic, all kinds of fabulous things. So there's research on the problems of not being mindful, and then there's ways that you can become more mindful. And a lot of it is just noticing. It is just paying attention. It is just being open to being wrong and being open to not knowing. And all of that I thought was just lovely. I think the book is lovely. And I love any book that has a lot of research and a lot of studies that I can point to for those people who hear about my work and wonder whether it's all a little bit out there and woo woo. As a trial attorney, especially, I defended doctors in medical malpractice cases. I cross examined a lot of doctors, and research and well grounded, well founded research was very important in that endeavor. And so I love a book that gives me some of that. So, second book is Mindfulness. The third book on my list, this book came out in 2017, and it's called Into the Magic Shop by James Doty, Doty. I've talked about this book on the podcast as well. James Doty is a neurosurgeon at Stanford, I believe. At least he was for a period of time. I work with a lot of neurosurgeons. Neurosurgeons operate on brains and spinal cords, and they tend to be pretty academic. But this book's main focus is magic. When James Doty was a kid, he wandered into a magic shop, and the lessons that he learned there sort of guided his whole life. And he returned to them even when he had sort of wandered off. So this book is about the brain and the heart. And Doty, as a neurosurgeon, seems to put the heart before the brain. And I loved it. And everyone that I recommended it to loved it as well. I heard about this book on a podcast, and I'm so glad that I did. It was a wonderful book. I got through it very quickly. It reads like a story, but it's got a lot of research as well. Highly, highly recommend it. The next book I've not only talked about here, but I've had the authors on the podcast. The authors are Justin Zorn and Leah Mars, and the book is Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. I think that it's no mistake that my word this year is notice. I think the best way to notice things is in silence. As I mentioned last week on the podcast, now when I walk the dog at night, I don't bring my phone. I don't have my headphones in so that I can be in silence and listening and noticing the sounds around me. And I think that this book really taught me the importance of noticing and listening and being aware. And I loved the chapter, Florence Nightingale would be pissed. We talked about that when we interviewed, but the health ramifications of noise and the health benefits of silence are things that I don't think we should forget about. I think we need to be really aware of what noise can do for us and to us. So I loved that book, and I loved my conversation with the authors. Highly, highly recommend. And then the last book on my list is a different one. I posted about this on my Instagram and got some feedback that I knew I wasn't surprised at. And it was, the name of the book is Against Empathy, and the author is Paul Bloom. Paul Bloom, the reason I read this book is in a week or so from when you're hearing this or seeing this, I'm going to be giving a TED Talk, and I'm giving a TED Talk about empathy and how it's not all that it's cracked up to be the way that we describe it. And in my TED Talk, I'm talking about the different kinds of empathy and how we need to be aware that one kind is better than the other. So when I saw that someone else was sort of against empathy, as the author title says, I knew I had to read this book. And Bloom takes a much different approach than I do. He really talks about the problems with empathy. And one of the things that he talks about that really struck me is that in general, as humans, we tend to have more empathy. We tend to be able to put ourselves in the shoes and the feelings and the eyes of other people when they look like us, and how that can be a problem when we're talking about different races or different cultures or different types of people. And so Bloom takes a strong case, makes a strong case that we should instead be focusing on rational compassion, what he calls rational compassion. This book was helpful for me in having the guts to sort of go against empathy in a certain way in my TED Talk, my TEDx talk. It's a TEDx. I'm not going to get into the difference, but TEDx is what most people do when they talk about doing a TED Talk. I'm doing a TEDx talk, and my TEDx talk is about empathy. So this book contributed to that. But I think it's worthwhile for anyone who's interested in the topic to read this book and be aware of some of the dangers of what we think about as empathy. And then the last book that I will name, this is an honorable mention, same as I gave fiction honorable mention. The honorable mention is Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be by Stephen Pressfield. I love Stephen Pressfield's work. The War of Art is a book that I reread all the time. I think Stephen, he also read The Legend of Bagger Vance, so he's written fiction and nonfiction, which is aspirational to me. And just the idea in this book that if you have a place where your heart wants to be, put your butt there. So if you want to be an author, put your butt in the chair and start writing. If you want to live in the New York City area, put your butt in Jersey City. That's what I've done this year. And so this book was inspirational for me that way. And I think that it's his writing is just so easy to read. And I enjoy this book very much. So those are my 5 fiction, 5 nonfiction books for 2022. I'm still reading. As I record this, there are 11 days left in the year, and some of those days I will be away. So I'm sure I will get many more books in towards the end of the year. But this is what we get for today. And I look forward to the books that I will be looking at reading in 2023. Books are my treasure. I just love them. When I'm sad, when I'm happy, when I'm lonely, when I'm blue, when I'm excited, when I'm motivated, books are the things I go to. So I would love to hear your books. You can comment on the YouTube if that's where you're watching. You can send me an email, heather@elegantwarrior.com. You can comment on my Instagram at I'm Heather Hansen. And in the new year, I'm thinking about doing a retreat / mastermind, maybe even 2, maybe one on the West Coast and one on the East Coast, where we talk about books, where we talk about advocating, where I teach you the skills so that you can advocate with elegance, so that you can use evidence, creating and collecting evidence to make changes in your life and help people to believe what you want them to believe. If that's interesting to you, you can let me know in the comments in any of those places, or in the coming weeks. I'm not going to ask my team to put this together now, but after the new year, we're going to have a pop-up landing page where you can fill out some information so we can see what the interest level is going to be. But I would love to meet you guys in person. I would love to spend some time with you, and I would love to share some of these ideas with you in a more thorough way so that you can really learn how to put these tools into action. In the meantime, I hope that you have a great week. I hope that you have a phenomenal start to 2023, and I hope that you take good care.